Welcome to another episode of A World in Tension. Today we're going to talk about the tension of Jesus's divinity versus humanity, but we're not going to attack that from like a theological, like trying to unpack the finer points of that. What we really want to look at today is what can we learn about studying Christ's humanity a little bit more and to see Jesus for who he is and how that impacts our life to not be kind of cultural Christians, but really be impacted by who he is as a man and say our Savior. So to help us do that, we have a guest. His name is Robert Rowe. He's the Student Ministries Coordinator of a ministry called seeJesus. So that's pointing you to look at Jesus closer right there. So Robert, thank you for joining us, and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Rob, it's good to be here. Man, you nailed like the intro. That was awesome.
Thank
you.
The
tension. Yeah, it's really good. I've been married for 26 years. My wife Rebecca, and we have 5 children. One with Jesus, and then 4 more here, 2 college students, a junior in high school, and the caboose. Our daughter is going into middle school. So I've been on staff with seeJesus for about almost 5 years now, ordained in the PCA, but it was on staff at PCA churches for about 20 years. Just felt what we're going to talk about today is part of the reason I'm with the ministry of seeJesus now, just the passion that things that have happened in my life. And yeah, so I'm a Tennessee boy, born, raised, and stayed so far, and love living in Chattanooga. I really enjoy it.
Well, and I heard Robert speak, and I was impacted by a statement of how seeing Jesus and looking at that lens in Scripture, to look at it as humanity and what we can learn from that. I was impacted, and I think you were deeply moved by that. So just tell us a little bit about why you think this is an important topic to talk about.
Gosh, there's so much in my own life that has changed just by simply studying Jesus as a person. I think that tension between this mountain of theology that I had that is great and all helpful to do life and to live life to the glory of God and all the things that we know to be right and true. But as I began to explore Jesus as a person, I realized there's also a reality to what it means to be fully human, to what it means to apprentice him and to follow him. And that journey, I'd love to get into the story of that a little bit, of how all that really, the spark that started with would be fun.
Well, Robert, I think it was interesting. You mentioned you've spent 4 years sort of in the Gospels. I can't think of a better way to try to experience the person of Jesus than that. So I'm sure that ends up being part of this story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm convinced they're the hinge of the Gospels are the hinge of Scripture, mm-hmm. And like we interpret and understand the Old Testament through the person and work of Jesus. We understand the epistles through the person and work of Jesus. And I think, especially, man, like when you get into reading the epistles and you realize that, I think, I'm not a math guy, but I did like 85% of the gospel or the epistle writers, and that doesn't include Hebrews, were eyewitness accounts of the greatest person that's ever lived. And so when they're talking about love, when they're talking about the fruit of the Spirit, when they're talking about all these aspects that we find in, being slow to speak, quick to listen, all those kind of things, I think all of those writers have Jesus just right in the forefront of their heart and their mind as they're writing. And they're writing about him. They're not just saying, pulling stuff out of thin air like, oh, this sounds like a good way to live life. They've watched life in the Word, the living Word.
Welcome to A World in Tension podcast, a place where we examine the opposing pulls and struggles of life to uncover clarity, purpose, and practical solutions. Come join us as we seek to get comfortable facing the uncomfortable. This is A World in Tension.
Well, Robert, obviously there was something that you kept bumping up against that kind of pushed you into this idea that you wanted to understand what it truly meant to follow Jesus? Tell me a little bit about your history and then how that came to be. What was it that you kept bumping up against, and why do you think you kept bumping up against it?
There's an aspect of life for me that as I had gone through seminary, I went through the painful, slow route of 9 years of seminary. And I think I had this mountain of theology, this wonderful stuff. And I was in the middle of, raising 4 kids, pastoring at a church, and doing life. And I just can't, this tension just kept hitting my heart of, man, I was hearing a lot of, gospel transaction language of kind of every time it was kind of like just every answer to every problem of my life was remember the gospel and tell yourself the gospel over and over again. And I believe that's true, but I just felt like at the core of that, there was a piece, there was some construct of that was missing for me. And so one of my friends, I was at a pretty, I was just discouraged as a follower of Jesus. And I was watching kind of the lives of people around me, that really believed and trusted this kind of formula, that we were, and I don't want to say that in a negative way. It's a true formula. Like I believe, but the word formula comes to mind because that's what it felt like in my heart and in my life. It's like, if I just get up in the morning, do kind of this, like, remember I'm a sinner, remember Jesus is great, his righteousness, I'm covered in it. Okay, go do life. It felt like for me, I had to do this calculus equation every morning to remind myself of that. And so there was something in my heart that just kept the tension of that, something wasn't landing.
I can relate to that. Like, I think when Christianity feels like a formula, you're usually like, well, this is it, right? Like,
right.
This can't be right. So what were some of those things you experienced in life, those markers? Because maybe other people are experiencing it too, and they don't even know.
Well, one big marker was somebody invited me to a one-day discipleship conference, and I honestly went into it. So I was such a skeptic. I was so cynical. I was like, oh man, I'm going to go sit through there. I'm going to feel, guilty about not making disciples and blah, blah, blah. I was going to hear the same thing again. And this guy started talking about, his name's Dan Spader. He has a ministry called Sun Life, a study of the sun's life. And he just started talking about Jesus in ways that I'd been a believer for 40 years, and I'd never heard anybody talk about Jesus this way. And maybe they had, and it was just the Spirit used it in the moment. But he was talking about Jesus, Jesus spent time in prayer. Jesus spent time in the Word. Jesus walked with the Spirit. Jesus is the fullness of humanity, and expanded on kind of that second Adam idea. And that's when I left that seminar. I probably could have just sat there for days, but I left that seminar in the midst of being an ordained PCA pastor, pastoring in a church. I realized at that moment that I had no idea who I was following.
Wow.
And it was a really scary but exciting moment for me. So I was like, man, I don't know if I want to tell anybody that I just don't know Jesus.
Well, talk through that a little bit, because I think you're talking at a heart level, because you knew mentally who you were following. You knew all the theology. Yeah. So what actually, talk a little bit more about at a heart level, like what your comment about you didn't know who you were following. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a theological level, I knew the work of Christ. So I knew kind of the cross and the resurrection Jesus, but I didn't know who he was as a person. And so I think that hit me, that moment for me, I just went back and started reading the Gospels, and the guy, Dan Spader, recommended getting a harmony of the Gospels. And so I just started reading through a harmony of the Gospels over and over and over again, and looking for stuff that would be, on the person of Jesus. And there just wasn't a lot out there. And I guess for the first time, Neil, I was excited. I was like, oh wow, like there's a whole nother realm of like this thing called following Jesus that I have not tapped into in his person. And I got really excited about it, but also at the same time, like, how did I miss this? And so ended up going to another discipleship conference about a year and a half later. And a guy got up and started hitting on it again. I was like, he's nailing, like, this is where my heart is right now. He's talking about Jesus as a person. So I went up and grabbed him right after he was done. And his name's Monty Starks. And I was like, Monty, like, I'm on this crazy journey. I don't know what to do. What's going on in my heart? I don't know what, like, this feels really weird. And he said, man, you have to look at Paul Miller's stuff on the person of Jesus. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, I knew Paul Miller as sonship, and I knew Paul Miller a praying life, but I didn't know Paul did anything on the person of Jesus. And then connected with Paul, and he was just really helpful in discipling me through a lot of that stuff and a lot of the tensions in my heart. It was really fun. It was like, a really, really amazing pastor in our denomination, Joe Novenson. I went to Joe and I just said, Joe, I'm really grappling with this. And he gave me just this wonderful illustration that only Joe can do. And he said, yeah, Robert, it's kind of like we've been fixed on the window of our theology. And really the point of all the theology is that we look through the window at the beautiful vista of Christ. And I had become fixated on the window and didn't see through it. And so for me, that was the spark that happened. And then I just, lots more there.
Yeah.
But
I mean, that's really interesting. My history is of looking at works a lot. I was raised in churches that really focused heavily on that. Paul Miller's sonship helped me to see that the life of Jesus and what he did and the why and the theology sort of made it much more impactful for both of us. Just seeing our sin and seeing what he did. And then that journey took us in a kind of an opposite direction. And then we dove deep into the theology. And so it seems like there's this ebb and flow between seeing the window and seeing the view. And it seems like a constant, delicate dance, certainly a tension. Because I'm hearing a little bit on the opposite side of that for you. So focused on the window and missing Christ.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
One thing cool that you said, though, that I think is important in any of this tension kind of journey is that you were kind of freaked out and uncomfortable, but also excited at the same time. And I feel like people push away tensions because they feel uncomfortable. They always feel uncomfortable. But the fact that you were excited, it's, people today call it a growth mindset, right? Like that would be like business lingo. But I think that's really important in terms of being curious and saying, wait a second, this kind of excites me that there's this new dimension of Christ. So I thought that was really cool. Let's talk about the different tensions here. It doesn't sound like it was more external tensions with other people. It sounds like more of a wrestling with yourself. So like what were some of the things you were debating in this? I mean, you're kind of thinking about your position and you're leading others. So talk through some of the things you were wrestling with internally.
Anger has always been this kind of besetting struggle for me throughout life. And as I got into fatherhood and began to get tension in relationships outside my family, I would carry that home and take it out on my kids in unhealthy ways. And so I think at some point, Paul Miller introduced me to studying the anger of Jesus. And he has this lesson on it. And so that's sparked a whole thing for me because I'm a very emotional person. So I've started studying the emotions of Jesus in the Gospels, and just fabulous. There's so much there that we have unearthed that's in the Gospels that we've just theologized or put them into systems and we missed. And so that's what I mean is studying Jesus as a person. So anger is one of those. And just watching him do good anger. And so my son, who was he was probably a junior in high school at the time, had one of those days at school, had no idea what happened, but he just lit into me. And my wife, who's very calm, demeanored person, she said, "Tyler, you're being really disrespectful to your father right now." And so he just kind of continues for a moment. And I didn't say anything, and I was really quiet. And he said, "Oh, so now you're going to give me the silent treatment." And so it was like, oh, like, you could feel the blood pressure going up in my face. And I said, "No, Tyler, I'm just thinking about Jesus right now." And so he storms off and goes upstairs, up to his room. He's really upset. And so I didn't react. I didn't enter the conflict at the time. And that's simply by just watching Jesus do anger in different ways, in different settings in the Gospels. And so literally my son is a quick repenter and just came back down within 5 minutes, gave me a hug. "Dad, I'm sorry. I was over the top. I blew it. Please forgive me." And the whole thing was done. Previous to me studying Jesus as a person and thinking about him as a person in those moments, the whole house would have been in conflict and lots of craziness going on, shouting and yelling and those kind of things. So that's an example of what I think, as I had been sitting in Jesus and just watching him, apprenticing him, watching the way he loves, watching the way he does life in the Gospels, just is life-giving.
As I'm reflecting on this process, what I'm hit by, and I've often done this and said this, and maybe you can tell me how to address this, but I wonder how many minutes of Jesus's life that we are exposed to in the Gospels. And so, I would almost want to go through and add it up, and I get to this point where I'm like, how much can we really get out of the maybe 25 hours of actual Jesus footage or red letters, so to speak, that we get? How much can we really pull out of it? And I'm hearing you say that, you have to dissect it. I mean, there's so much there. But I think that's my temptation, is to wonder, okay, how do we get it? How do we mine it?
Yeah.
You know? And that's why I think I was so, I was hit by how much time you've spent in the Gospels on those minutes, dissecting the emotions and the nuances of what he did and how he did it.
Yeah, just watching him relate to people. One thing I've read through the Gospels a lot, so each time I kind of usually have this I'm going to look at this aspect. So one time it was, I'm just going to look at the questions that Jesus asked. And he asked 103 questions in the Gospel of Matthew.
The fact that that's awesome.
It's insane. Why is the second person of the Trinity asking so many questions? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what do I learn from that? Well, I learned that the art of curiosity, that Jesus loved to have people discover. And he wasn't always just a truth teller dropping bombs everywhere he went, but he was often inviting people in to discover. And so he would ask a question and just sometimes not even answer, just let the question sit. And so simple things like that, Rob, where I'm like, oh, wow, that really transforms my life. I can imitate that. I can be a good question asker. I can be like Jesus and become a good listener and not speak all the time, right? So those kind of, And those are the subtleties that are in the Gospels that we just miss.
I think that's fantastic, because I think the other thing I think about when you're talking about that is our tendency to need to put a bow on things and button it up and make it perfect. Like you said, sometimes he let the question sit because he knew the person needed time with it.
Like, here's the greatest evangelist who's ever walked, right? Jesus. Mm-hmm. He shares the gospel with a rich young ruler, tells him to go sell all that he has, and he lets the guy leave. Jesus was okay sitting in the tension of an unresolved salvation. Jesus trusted the Spirit to work in that man's life. And so he didn't have to white knuckle. And like, that's another just really simple thing I learned from Jesus is I can trust the Spirit in life. Like when something's not going my way, or when someone's not reacting like I think they should, take a deep breath, calm down, trust the Spirit, let the Spirit work.
I'm trying to contextualize what you said today. Like, some celebrity is like, you're having a conversation with some celebrity and they're interested in Jesus. They want to know. And you would want to say, you'd want to try so hard to control it, to say, think about the influence this person could have, or whatever else, instead of really surrendering in. I mean, like, he trusted the Father, he trusted the Spirit.
Yeah.
He let it go. I think that's so helpful.
Ultimately, as we talk about tension and we talk about the poles, and we suggest that the actual tension between the two poles is something that God has used to help us depend on Christ. It almost seems like stopping and looking at the life of Christ is a practical way of surrender. I mean, that's what I was hearing in your story about your son. You were able to stop and think about Jesus, and you didn't react. Something about things that you remembered learning about him helped you to take the tension out of the room.
Part of what it's done in my life is it's taken faith from being kind of this right formula, this gospel transformation, and it's made faith sticky. It's made that gospel transformation helpful language become sticky in my life by watching it lived out in the person of Jesus. So he makes, in the end, ultimately, we all fall in love with people. Generally, we don't fall in love with ideas. We fall deeper in love with people than we do ideas. And so, that's one of my great convictions of why I'm doing what I'm doing now with seeJesus, is because I sense that there's that for a few decades now we've tried to convince younger generations, to fall in love with ideas, and this kind of Jesus is an ideology instead of a person. And but when you fall in love with people, it's harder to let go of them.
Well, and I want to talk about that practically, because I was thinking about that moment with your son, about you were saying, I'm thinking about Jesus. Talk a little bit about what was going actually through your mind in that really tense moment. And your son's probably like, you're being pious, right? But that's not what you were doing. So talk about what you were doing.
The story that comes to mind is when Jesus is in the synagogue, and the man with the withered hand, and it seems like it's a setup by the Pharisees, like, let's see if he's going to heal on the Sabbath kind of thing, trap that they always do. And so Jesus just invites the guy. He's like, hey, you want to talk about this man? Let's talk about him. And they have Jesus has the man stand in front of everyone. And he just presents like a question that a second grader could answer. Is a man more valuable than a sheep? And the Pharisees are just silent because they know they're caught, right? And then in Mark's gospel it says that Jesus turned and looked at them in anger, and so there's like these moments of like, oh wow, like there are times when anger is a good thing, and there's times when anger is unhealthy, and most of the time in my life, I fell on either side of the track. Either it's all anger is bad, or really bad anger gets really unhealthy quickly. And I never saw anger as a good anger that can be practiced well. And man, the emotions of Jesus is a really fun. Like if I want to be emotionally healthy, I should probably watch the guy who was the most emotionally healthy person that's ever lived.
Yeah, and I think conversation about emotions probably starts to make people feel who are very theologically minded like squirrely, right?
Oh man,
like,
I love making it squirrely. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So talk to that person. Why should they study the emotions of Jesus and not get freaked out that you're going off the rails? Like, what would you say to them?
Paul Miller always brings up it took the church 1900 years before anybody wrote any critical work on the emotions of Jesus. And B.B. Warfield's pamphlet. It's astounding how long, and part of that is because we've just missed him as a person, and that traces back all the way to Gnostic and Greek influences early in the church, that I think we lost that sense of the Jew. When a Jew talked about a person, it was very holistic, right? And we know, as ones who believe the Bible is true and that God created us in his image, that part of the way he created us was with emotions. Like we have them, right? Yes, they're fallen, just like our mind is fallen. And one of my arguments is to people is like, when I'm trying to use logic in an answer, does that mean that, do I do that because I actually think my mind is less fallen than my emotions? I think they're equally fallen, but the beauty is that they're all being renewed and remade after the image of Jesus. And so that includes my emotional life. So I should be more emotionally healthy as a follower of Jesus than I was a year ago.
That's kind of the irony of things, is all of the logic, all of the thinking, all of the research we're doing to try to bolster our emotional connection to the Savior and to God. I mean, the end, in a sense, is to feel emotionally connected to the living God. So, I mean, ultimately, even the people who are focused on reason and logic and trying to argue their way into belief are doing so because they want to feel connected emotionally to something bigger than themselves.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. In this whole, just kind of probing into the deepest core here, what do you think in trying to see Jesus's humanity and tap into the emotions, for you personally, what do you think you had to let go of control of to surrender to this concept? Because I think it's right. What was the hardest thing, do you think you had to wrestle with?
That surrender of like, okay, I'm no longer going to just float. I'm no longer just going to be comfortable doing this thing called Christianity because it's what everybody else is doing in my culture. That was like a really moment of surrender for me, where I was like, I need to know the guy I'm following. Mm-hmm. Like if I don't know him, like forget the rest of this. Like this just doesn't make any sense. And so there was a real surrender of like giving up this way of doing Christian life and trading it in, or not necessarily trading it in, but it being transformed by the realities of knowing the one I'm following. My definition of sanctification now is beauty formation, and I think that's what was that's what the Spirit was doing in my life, is creating beauty. Like I know where the Spirit is taking. Like the aim of the Spirit is to make us beautiful, like the image of our Savior. And there's beauty formation. And that became very exciting for me, and moved me out of the realm of that. Like I've shared before, I fell in love I went to Tennessee Tech University, right? Go Eagles. Right? Not much to cheer about in the sports world for the Eagles. But I was walking around on the Tennessee Tech campus, and I met this girl in Blockbuster Video.
What's Blockbuster?
Yeah, what is Blockbuster? And like I fell in love with beauty. in that moment. And that girl became my wife. But I didn't fall in love with the beauty or the idea. Marriage is a really beautiful idea. But I fell in love with this beautiful person who then, now 26 years later, I love the beauty of marriage. So the person and the truth of it go hand in hand, but I think we fall in love with people more readily than we do with ideas.
All right, Robert, I think that's a pretty good segue to talk about how do we apply these truths. I love that you kind of came down to it. It's like, I need to know this guy I'm following, right? Like that's the core, like a core question that changes a lot of things as you come back out on the surface, right? So talk about how this impacted your walk and what you started to do in that internal message with others, in conversation with others. Talk a little bit about that journey back out and how you were trying to be more, basically be an agent of redemption for Christ in this world.
What's happened is I've started to think, like when a question's asked, my immediate thought has now become, I wonder how Jesus would react in this situation. Or I wonder, how would Jesus answer this question? Or how would Jesus, and it's kind of that, what would Jesus do? Like,
I was just
right?
thinking about the bracelets. Yeah, I was like, what would Jesus do?
I mean, there is some real beauty to that, I mean, gosh,
I was looking at your wrist,
I don't have one on. I would wear one, but, Christianity loves to make all things cheesy, and we make coffee mugs and floor mats of WWJD and all that.
and yet it was.
But it really is beautiful.
It really is beautiful.
Yeah. And I think, and not from a legalistic perspective or moralism, but for me, it was just this real heart of longing to do life as I watched him do life.
Yeah, I mean, give us one more practical story of an example where that's really, you've been like, okay, this is really informing how I'm talking to a person.
The example that I think of is when Jesus finishes feeding the 5,000. He sends the disciples away on the boat. They're on the Sea of Galilee. And it says he went up in the evening and they were struggling at the oar. Like he was watching them struggle at the oar. Well, interestingly enough, it says it's a quick exchange, but it says, and then he went to them walking on the water on the fourth watch of the night. I'm like, that's interesting. So evening, he went up on the mountain at 6. Evening time for Jewish days around 6 p.m. Could be anywhere from 6 to 9, whatever. But he sees them struggling at the oar, but he doesn't go to them until the fourth watch of the night, which is like 3 to 6 a.m. So Jesus sat up on the mountain talking to his Father for 9 to 12 hours and let them struggle. And so I think another example of that is, and man, you talk about a tension, like the tension between praying and waiting on God to answer, and how do you live in the tension of his silence? And good grief, that's a really hard one, right? We lived that with our first daughter who passed away of congenital heart defects, the tension of why are you silent? What are you doing? And I think that, man, that's a massive one, but that Jesus was providing space. And if he hadn't provided this space, I don't know that their faith would have grown to the point where Peter, is sinking. He says, Lord, save me. And then there's kind of this change in the language, and Jesus immediately reaches in and grabs him. So it's sitting in that tension of how to practically that works itself out by helping me be okay to give people space. It helps me practically wait on the Lord, who sometimes is slow in his timetable. I want him to move faster. He's doing something in there. He's changing, perhaps even changing what I'm praying for in the waiting period.
It was interesting what you said. I never thought about what you said about that duration of time, and how I wonder if he came out to the boat a half hour later of struggle, would would Peter have want to have walked out on the water?
Yeah.
I don't think he would have. I think that part of the struggle, and that's speculation, right? But I think part of the struggle is the depth of it, tapping into the emotion of what is actually going on and your need, dependence for Christ. But so as we close here, like, what would you give as kind of, I mean, I think you've given us a ton of practical things from the get-go, so I appreciate that. But what would you give as kind of like a final exhortation to a listener who maybe has never considered about like, oh wait, I can actually, like what you said about you fall in love with the person, I think is something really to grab onto. But like, how would you encourage that person who's never fallen in love with the person of Jesus, or how do they get there?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think you have to begin by just immersing yourself in the Gospels and getting to know Him, and looking at it, trying to look at it from I'm entering into these 4 books, and I just my single goal is I want to get to know Jesus and watch the way He interacts with people. Watch the way sometimes he pulls back, sometimes he moves forward, sometimes he's, like yesterday I was just reading, like from John 12 on, Jesus begins this emotional word of his soul begins to be troubled. And I'm like, man, just sit in that a while. It's okay. Like, to think like, man, why was Jesus troubled? Like the Prince of Peace is troubled. Mm-hmm. Like, talk about attention. How do we resolve that one? So I think it's just being, the more you get to know Him as a person, you become captivated with Him. And I would encourage, a harmony of the Gospels is a really beautiful, there's one I brought it with me because Thomas and Gundry do a great job. They're just paralleled columns. They're not mixed together. And so you just begin to see, I think for me, it was very helpful because I'm not smart enough to remember like, oh, did Mark mention this story? Did John, like, where is this again? There's a nuance here in Mark. And so when you have them paralleled, you can really pick up on and then you start adding in there like, oh, so this Mark is Peter's telling of Jesus' life. Luke is eyewitnesses. And so all these things like start coming together you just start seeing these details that pop about him as a person that our Western minds generally, and even in me for seminary, we're not trained to see things through a person lens. We're trained through for more of an idea lens.
Well, I've been greatly encouraged, Robert. I mean, I think you've accomplished your goal with me, at least, of wanting to get more in the Gospels, wanting to see Jesus more. Absolutely. Like, you've encouraged me, so I hope you've also encouraged the listener.
I think you've also really helped us to kind of reinforce this idea of tensions being, used by Christ to lead us to Him.
Amen. So that's cool. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I loved how you said it's okay. The Prince of Peace, but he felt in anguish, right? Like, it's okay. That's what we're trying to say here. It's learn from that, right? Mm-hmm. And rest in Jesus. Yeah. But thanks again for joining us, Robert. It's been a pleasure. Thanks,
Neil and Rob. It's been really fun.
We've enjoyed it, and thanks again for joining us for another episode of A World in Tension.